Bon dia a tothom, buenos días, good morning. Em plau donar-vos a tots els que ens
Very
esteu.
happy to welcome all of you to the virtual session carried out by CIDOB, together with the metropolitan area of Barcelona, in which we have the pleasure to have Rim Ayadi, the founder and president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association. We'll talk about the effects of the pandemic socially and economically in the Mediterranean, in sectors, territories, and groups who have paid a very high price. And it's also a time in which we will talk about the exit ways for the crisis, which, as we know, has actually had a terrible effect with a systemic crisis we have all suffered from. Now, it's a crisis in which it adds to the health crisis, the economic crisis, and that's why we can talk about a recovery and reconstruction agenda. This is a global discussion, but today we have a chance to talk about the Mediterranean basin with our guest speaker and to wonder what we should do to reconstruct what we already had by you all thinking about economic and social models that are different. And you may have a chance to amend some of the things that were not being done well. So we have this historical opportunity, this opportunity window for the future, given that we can't change the past. And we have to face the consequences of the crisis we have, but with an economic opportunity for the countries in the Mediterranean basin. These are the questions we have to answer.
As president of CIDOB, I would like to thank you, our guest and speaker, Mrs. Rim Ayadi, for accepting our invitation to give a conference of the Mediterranean in a context of economic and social recovery. Finalment, jo acabaré aquí, la meva intervenció per tant serà
So
breu.
I'm going to finish my presentation words here, and I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Ernest Maragall, whom, as you know, is the Vice President of the International Organization of the Metropolitan Area of Barcelona, who will introduce our guest speaker. And we thank him for his presence, and allow me to thank Ernest Maragall and the Metropolitan Area of Barcelona for their support and their commitment with CIDOB. Thank you very much indeed. Ernest Maragall and the whole Metropolitan Barcelona area for your support. And finally, I'd like to inform our audience, that those who follow us through the YouTube channel, that after Mrs. Ayadi's presentation, there will be a Q&A session through the chat, which will be moderated by Paul Morillas, the director of CIDOB. Ernest, you have the floor. Once again, thank you, and Ernest, you have the floor. Fine. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much indeed, Chairman of CIDOB, Mr. Antonio Segura.
We are glad to be here. So we are far, but you are near also. We are very close in the space, but still more in interest. And I think I am sure also in the way you think, in the way you are about to explain us a lot of things. Estem avui aquí, doncs, per escoltar...
We're here today to listen to Mrs. Ayadi, and to do so, after her presentation, we'll have a dialogue, because we do not always have the chance to listen to such a well-informed voice and such an involved voice in issues that we want to discuss here today, the situation we find ourselves in. The title is quite explicit: the Mediterranean in the context of recovery post-COVID-19. The fact that she has such an academic record, such a professional record, is the best guarantee, but it's also a great opportunity to listen to her. I believe that, the fact that it's her on behalf of what the organization she is actually presenting. As the president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, EMEA is already a great guarantee. As president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association is a great guarantee. But if we go over her CV, which is very, very long, and I won't go over it, it's even more stimulating and to listen to her, especially if we look at her experience in different institutions, associations, and universities all over the world, in Europe, in Canada, Slovenia, London, Paris, etc. I believe that we have today a world-renowned guest speaker, one of the best positioned ones to carry out an analysis. And, well, my question, Mrs. Ayadi, is what can we do? How should we go about, how should we approach this very demanding present time in which we are all set? And it's not a future issue. Of course it is about the future and how we imagine a world that we know must be different from the one we have lived so far. Or if we look at a few years ago, we should draw the conclusion that we have a lot of lessons yet to be learned. The pandemic has actually shown us all of the contradictions that we already had, or that maybe we didn't want to see or we didn't know how to see, and now we need to face them. Contradictions that were translated and that are still translated, and the pandemic has accentuated in terms of inequality, precariousness, dependency on production models and economic models that have been shown to be obsolete or totally unable to respond. Now, faced with this, clearly we have this question. I am absolutely convinced, some people say that we are in just a, we're just at a very time-bounded standstillness. But, we will all come back once the machinery starts working again, we will create all sorts of jobs, etc. But I think there is something beyond that. There is an open concept that, what does transformation mean today? What does recovery mean if it doesn't imply a transformation? And I believe that Mrs. Ayadi is the best person to start finding answers to all of these questions. When I read your CV, your main line research today is focused on redesigning an inclusive global and sustainable financial system, and a stable one that could actually serve better long-term economic goals, bearing in mind the diversity of corporate models and business models, PPPs, public-private partnerships, new financing models, the funding of SMEs, or the role played by the financial markets, then it is exactly what it's all about. The point is to have a chance to take advantage of this wisdom and this vision and this experience. So we expect a lot from you, Mrs. Ayadi. We expect a lot from this lesson and this message that Mrs. Ayadi is about to addressing to us. And so I hope you will all enjoy this very fruitful cooperation between the AMB and CIDOB, the Metropolitan Area of Barcelona and CIDOB. We will have many new opportunities to have this fruitful interaction in terms of social and general interests. And the best way to do so is to give now the floor to Mrs. Ayadi. Mrs. Ayadi, you have the floor. You have the floor, Mrs. Ayadi, and thank you for being here with us today.
Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you very much for inviting me to the CIDOB seminar. I know CIDOB for many years, and we had a great collaboration in the past, and I hope we continue this great collaboration. So my talk today is based, as Mr. Ernest Maragall mentioned it, it's based on the work of many years, which in fact the Euro-Mediterranean Economists Association, which is based in Barcelona, not far, it's true, we are not far, and the Euro-Mediterranean Network for Economic Studies, research that we have done on socioeconomic development and resilience, already pre-COVID-19, but also COVID-19 has been a shock, an external shock, which has translated into, I would say, economic shocks, social shocks, and beyond this. And of course, it put a lot of pressure on our economic systems to testing the capacity to resist, in fact, and the resilience of these systems. And in the Mediterranean specifically, because my talk will be focusing on the Mediterranean this morning. So I have my slides here, and I would like to start with you. And you mentioned, Ernest, that we are not there to really predict what's going to happen, because this is not going to happen as simply as that, but trying to really think with a kind of a normative approach to shape the future we want. And the future we want is, in fact, we've started to work on it previously to the COVID-19, because we've seen that we were moving already into an economic model which is neither transparent, nor inclusive, nor responsible, and nor sustainable. And we moved into a system where we've seen a lot of inequalities, and this has really created a lot of discontent all over the world. It's not only in the Mediterranean. Mediterranean, in my view, is the region where, and when I say the Mediterranean, I always focus on South and East and West, where it has been already in turmoil since 2010 and even before that. So as I mentioned, we base our analysis and assessment on what we call the TRIS model for development in a context of global transitions, mainly driven by digitalization, automation, which has already started prior to the COVID-19. Adding to this, the new transition we are living in, which is the healthcare transition. We were not ready for it, clearly, but we are in this transition. So this model, as you see it here in front of you, TRIS is the acronym of some guiding principles that should drive development and this new model for socioeconomic development I mentioned. First of all, the transparency, which is aimed in reality to build trust. Trust is key in economic systems, which is also the basis for greater accountability of past, present decisions, actions, and intentions, particularly when the current generations or the current generation is indebting the future generation. Second is responsibility, also to manage the possible intended and unintended consequences in the future and also reflect on their ethical acceptability. Every action we do has to be responsible for the others. And this is important in terms also of the overall concept of citizenship in these countries and beyond this. Inclusiveness, of course, you know it, to take into account what is societally desirable in the current generations. It's extremely important to look at all the different segments of the population and not to leave anybody behind. And obviously sustainability, sustainable, of course, to take into account what is left for future generation in terms of, for example, intergenerational endowment, natural resources, so not to go too much onto extractive modes and then pollution, and also preservation of biodiversity, environmental related issues, and all of this, you know it. So what makes all of this even more complicated is that we are living into very simultaneous transitions in terms of digitalization, rethinking of globalization, also automation, and trying, you know, all the systems that we knew many years ago are changing over time. And then, of course, to make the matter worse, we had the pandemic on the top of all of this. Now, the TRIS model, in reality, takes into account, as I mentioned to you, the global transitions. And we need to think long term to be able to design the right policies in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and everywhere we need to have a long-term thinking. So here, as you see in this slide, we are thinking of either a conservative future, which is eventually a repetition of what we live today, which is not sustainable, but also wanting to go into transformative future, which is looking really to move into a new paradigm, financial, economic, and social. And we are moving into this paradigm, but we don't know where we're going yet. Now, this means also that we are moving into a direct governance transition, which is from a top-down approach. So we've seen it already in the Mediterranean. Back then, majority of the countries over there were dictatorships. Nowadays, we are moving slowly into some sort of horizontal, democratic, and eventually, but not in all countries, cooperative type of governance. But this is not in all countries. In other countries, in some countries, they are moving into this direction, but in other countries, they are really anchoring as much as possible to what I call this conservative future, which is the H1, again, top-down approach. The second one is the societal transition. Societal transition is really, we must move from an addicted, induced consumption model to a responsible form of consumption and lifestyle. And this is not happening yet. In some countries that are very sensitive to sustainability, to sustainable consumption and production, yes, but not in those countries we're talking about. And third is the green transition. This is really going fast now all over the world, and we have to move in reality from extractive, acquisitive resources model into a circular way to use energy and natural resources. Now, the Mediterranean has always based its economic model on rents of gas, oil, and all of this. But then we need to move from this type of models and then think with innovation and with knowledge base to move into a different type of models. And then finally, the economic transition, which in reality, trying to move a bit more from the corporate capitalism to a distributed type of an inclusive type of capitalism. Now, obviously, the path from this H1, what I call it the conservative scenario, to the transformative scenario emphasizes obviously innovation, breakthroughs, and daring pathways to move into a different future. And then, as I want to say that COVID-19 has only accelerated this path. So we have started already in this path, but now COVID-19 made everybody think that this is not the model that we want to continue with. Now, this model is not, in reality, it's not new, okay? But then the way it is presented probably is a bit different. It is, in fact, very much aligned with the UN SDGs. Currently, a MEA research team is also working on this interaction between the 4 principles I mentioned before and the UN SDGs to be able to measure the TRIS development model anchored in the 17 goals of the United Nations. Now, another thing I want to mention to you, so this is to explain to you the thinking behind my talk today, the TRIS development model and how it can offer a very nice model for resilience. And we have enhanced our thinking in this direction, and we wanted to see to what extent this TRIS model that we're talking about here is can be resilient to external shocks. And what we have lived, the COVID-19, is an extreme shock, which has created a lot of stress globally, but particularly in the regions that are not prepared. And then let me say one thing about resilience. What do I mean by resilience? Resilience, in fact, is the capacity of a system to recover from adversity, from either temporary shocks or sometimes even simultaneous shocks, but then it returns to its original state or eventually moving to a new steady state. And this is the thinking between what I call the conservative scenario and the transformative scenario. And we want to move into a transformative scenario, and this is what I said before. Now, the two main dimensions of the shocks, which in fact they determine how the system responds to them, is the intensity and the persistence. And I think this is very important because these two variables determine the intensity of the response needed for the system to bounce back. We need to bounce back to absorb the change when the shock is limited, so it's easy to absorb, but then, or to adapt to the change when the shock is significant but not disruptive, and to transform the system itself when the shock is disruptive. And I think, again, for the COVID-19, the shock is disruptive. And this is why the need to move into a transformative future, and we need to move fast into that. Now, to make TRIS, which is the model I mentioned to you, resilient to respond to extreme shocks, such as what I mentioned, this pandemic, but also, let us not forget that these pandemics, they will not be one. There will be further pandemics. There might be even more shocks, for example, extreme global warming, flooding, terrorist attacks. There are many other types of extreme shock that our systems, our economic systems, social systems must be ready to adapt and to transform. Now here, and I will finish my concept model, and then I move to the specifically to the Mediterranean. We introduce 3 pillars to make the TRIS development model, I would call it, more resilient. And these are the 3 pillars based on early warning system, crisis management system, and then recovery and adaptation and transformation system. And these are 3 pillars, in my view, that must be working hand in hand to allow the system to rebound back very fast. So the first system, which I call it the early warning system, is to prepare, prevent, measure the risks, and prepare the optimal policy response. The second is to enhance the effectiveness and to manage the risks. And these are really the policies that are inputted at the same time of the crisis to manage, in reality, the crisis. And then the last is the recovery and the adaptation system, which is the short and long-term solution to bounce back. So obviously, this system has a cost, and to have a cost which is also depending on the nature of the cost. Sorry, I think my dog. Sorry, just sorry. Okay, so this is in fact the TRIS model and the resilience for the system. Now, I would like to share with you another paper, which is a GRC paper, Joint Research Center paper, which is really thinking in the same direction toward, in fact, how are we going from a shock system, and moving into what I call an integrated approach to deal with the assets, the engine, the outcomes, and the interconnection between themselves. So in fact, as I mentioned previously, the COVID-19 shocked our systems at 3 levels. And this is in fact the levels of the asset, the levels of the engine, and also the level of the outcome. Now, resilience, in fact, builds on learning from the past and current shocks, in a sense that stress can serve as an opportunity to rethink, progress, and bounce back, even stronger than before. And this is actually what I was trying to explain. In fact, we need to really move from this absorption capacity of the system, of the shock, into adaptation, into transformation. And this is what this paper, and I really invite you to read it all, to give this idea. And it goes hand in hand in reality with these 3 pillars, the 3-pillar system I mentioned, which is the preparedness, early warning, crisis management, and crisis recovery system to prepare for the next crisis. Now, okay, the shock happened. And where have we lived? What have we lived over the year and a half since it happened? So in reality, this is also linked to the level of preparedness of our economies and our societies to absorb this type of shocks. And we've seen it. The countries that have been prepared to face this shock were they lived it better than other countries that were not prepared. And I would also like to add that there is a very important dimension during this crisis, which is the level of acquired responsibility. Now, if we look at the history, this is not the only extreme shock that we lived. There were many other shocks, for example, linked to the Spanish flu, the Black Death, and others. But as I mentioned before, was our humanity, or is our humanity, prepared to face such a shock? Now, let's see what we've seen in the Mediterranean over this 1 year and a half. So the damage that COVID-19 has created in the Mediterranean countries is huge, and we don't even know whether the picture that we've seen is the real picture or not. And this is the problem of the transparency. Transparency, to what extent the data that we receive is really reflecting the real situation on the ground. So I've seen reports that show that the number of deaths in 2021 is much larger worldwide than the total number of deaths in 2020. And we are still in June, so we will see what will happen up to the end of this year. Now, looking at the tests, and this is very important because the tests are also allowing us to see what is the prevalence of the damage or of the infection rate of this pandemic. And we can see a trend now in the Mediterranean countries, it's going down. So it seems that the testing is not going as much as it used to be before because all the thinking is focused absolutely on the vaccines. Now, what we have done at EMEA is also to track the containment, the decontainment, and the recontainment policies that have been, in a way, worked to a certain extent, but in certain countries, for example, such as Lebanon, Tunisia, the health crisis was not the only culprit. They both suffer from political and economic crisis, which limited their capacity and the capacity of the government to respond effectively. Now, looking at the vaccine, and this is current, we are not advancing at the speed required in the Mediterranean countries, except for Israel, which has managed to accelerate vaccination and inoculate all its population. And also European countries have shown, speedy, process in this respect. Now, looking at the South Mediterranean, all of them are lagging behind, although there are some differences. For example, Morocco is doing a bit better, Turkey a bit better. But then all the others, you see them in the back of this the graph, they are not. And of course, if looking at Africa, it's even worse. Now, looking at the global situation, just to compare for you what is the situation in terms of the vaccine, Africa and Middle East, you can see it there on the red Africa over there, and Middle East are not being vaccinated as much as it is needed, and will certainly hamper the already uncertain global recovery. And this is very important to keep in mind. Now, beyond these numbers, the post-COVID-19 consequences is not only about those data that I showed to you, it's also about the post-COVID-19 consequences on health, physical and mental, that will increase in reality the health and social security cost. And in my view, in my opinion, the impact must be very carefully assessed and monitored over the next years. Now, in terms of the socioeconomic damage that COVID has resulted. Now, the GDP growth has suffered tremendously because despite the ample fiscal and monetary measures deployed to face the containment measures, now, if you look at these numbers, only Turkey and Egypt have green numbers, means they did not have some destruction of value over the pandemic year, which can be explained by several factors that, in my view, should be very carefully examined. Now, moreover, in fact, the cost of the pandemic has been very dire, particularly in countries which do not have prior fiscal space. And we can see here that the pandemic has increased the general government gross debt over not all countries, of course, but again, there is an increase of sovereign debt over this year, and this is why there is the whole debate, particularly in the low and middle income countries, about the debt suspension service initiative, which was spearheaded by the G20 and by the World Bank. Now, I'm not going to say that, of course, COVID-19 has further exacerbated trends that were already there in the Mediterranean, like there is now higher poverty, higher inequality, higher unemployment, particularly for the youth, higher informality. The two population segments that have suffered most in this pandemic are women and youth. And it also has been quite detrimental, disastrous for the education and training systems in the Mediterranean. We can see that thousands of children were out of schools and over these years, and I think this also needs to be looked at very carefully. Now, in the next slides, I want to give you some ideas regarding, what should be taken into account in the recovery process based on the discussion or based on the presentation I made. First of all, preparedness is essential. The more the systems are prepared, the least the shock could be disastrous. And here what we have tried to do is to develop what we call the Socioeconomic Preparedness Index, which shows very clearly which are the countries that were more or less prepared in terms of fiscal space, in terms of social policy, in terms of other aspects which are important to tackle this pandemic. Now, only countries that have deep pockets and comprehensive social policy could manage with time the short-term consequences of the pandemic. And clearly, those are only the three countries. Morocco, the capacity is quite low as compared to others. Algeria, which is an exporter of oil and gas. And then, of course, and you can also see here the case of Turkey. Now, some of these countries, as you can see, the policy responses were not so strong. I mean, Egypt has been quite, although they were kind of not prepared. And this is why I said to you, the case of Egypt and Turkey, we need to study them specifically, and to better understand the underlying factor of how they really managed this crisis. Now, putting a zoom on the health care sector. I think the healthcare sector is a key sector to strengthen. Because if we look at the preparedness level of this sector and also relative to global averages, which is the Global Health Security Index, which is calculated by International Organization WHO, I mean, globally, the healthcare sectors are not very well prepared, globally. Of course, there are some variances between the countries, but clearly the global, the average score for 40.2 is quite low. And then, based on those countries, you can see, for example, in the case of Algeria, the score is pretty low, and also Tunisia is quite low. It's below average. Jordan is more or less a little bit below average. Morocco and Lebanon, they had a bit higher, but still, all of them, they suffered a lot during the crisis. So as you see here, also specific numbers, which in reality you could see that they were low health expenditures, and then low numbers of bed and healthcare workers, and overall overall more should have been done and more should be done to face further future pandemics and future health crises. Now, in terms of the crisis management system, this was known to everybody, and then the countries have faced the pandemic based on expanding national supplies of PPEs, finding and building new facilities for COVID-19 patients, and increasing testing capacity, and so on. But again, it is clear to me that the big problem today is the infrastructure under capacity to distribute and administer the vaccines, particularly for the vaccines that need specific logistical conditions. And this is what needs to be really strengthened to facilitate or to help the recovery. Now, the majority of these countries that we studied in the South Mediterranean, they have implemented some measures and intervention plans with a short-term emergency approach. So they could not really, because since they were very little prepared, they were rushing really to react to the pandemic with whatever they could have. Now, some countries, like, for example, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, they presented some medium to long-term initiatives toward resilient recovery. But then remains to be really seen whether those are functioning and how they would be functioning, particularly when the situation of the countries in terms of political and socioeconomic is fragile. What I can see clearly that in these Mediterranean countries, the factors of fragility and vulnerability are increasing. Now, there has been a very important role and the engagement of the international community, for example, the European Union, IMF, World Bank, others, but more needs to be done really to address the long-term health and socioeconomic consequences for COVID-19. So it should be really what I call a coordinated approach as much as possible for the Mediterranean and Africa also, to really drive this region into a path for recovery and resilience. Now, as I mentioned, adaptation and transformation, I wanted to put a focus on cities. Of course, these next slides are not exhaustive, but just to give an idea to reflect on what we want to achieve over the years to come. The road, of course, what is important, first of all, is to understand the magnitude of the damage. So then to better understand what could hamper the recovery path and a resilient recovery path in a way, and to prepare for the next crisis. So first of all, I think it is extremely essential to think and prepare for the next crisis with economic and social buffers. We learned it from the financial crisis. Banks that have been in the past better capitalized after the financial crisis of 2007, 2009, they were part of the solution this time, and they were very happy to say it. Of course, they have been used by the regulatory authorities and the monetary authorities to channel the helps to the SMEs, to the customers, and all of this. This is important. Also, to learn from the health crisis and to consider it as one of many. So it's not really fatality, but then to learn from it. For example, I gave some ideas here. For cities and territories, to adapt the spaces. Now we know that it's good to have some sort of preventive distancing, in terms of space, and this helps. Also to generalize hygiene and cleaning and innovate on the material of building that are resistant, for example, to virus. There is research on it, and I think this we need to learn from it. Also to learn from digital infrastructures, to invest in digital infrastructures, and to see that digitalization overall has been quite a pillar for allowing the economic and social systems to continue functioning. Also to develop a communal and nature-based solution as buffers for future crises is important for the cities overall. And also to stress test different scenarios of production and consumption. So not only to be waiting for example, import and export to function, because in reality, during the COVID-19, the global value chains have been disrupted. And this is important also to have these, what I call the buffers to deal with future crises. And also to accelerate the green transition toward low carbon economy and to focus on the environmental and biodiversity protection target. This is key. I think this is what we need to see. So the future is within reach, in my view. Need to focus on the post-COVID-19 and post-carbon cities and territories, emphasizing on those pillars for resilience, and I mentioned them before: preparation and early warning, digitalization, circularity, innovation and knowledge-based, collaboration and solidarity. And finally, and I would like to close with this slide, is to go beyond the silos and have a new systemic integrated approach for territorial quality of life, building on the personal, building on the socioeconomic and ecological spheres, and also trying to move from the life enablers to life maintenance and up to life flourishing. And these are the new concepts that are being now developed in Europe, and at EMEA and at IMNES, with our colleagues and partners, we are trying to continue the development of this approach and mainstreaming to the Mediterranean and Africa, and hoping for a better future, but at least preparing for a worse future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rim. It's been really a comprehensive overview on both the challenges ahead right after the pandemic, but also dwelling on things that were very much present in the region before the pandemic, and probably the pandemic has only accelerated or exacerbated the amount of challenges that we are facing, and also the more structural dimensions to be taken into account. And I think you covered a lot of ground in your presentation, so thank you very much for that. I will now give the floor to the audience and see the different questions that might have come as a consequence of your presentation. There are two aspects that I would like you to go a bit deeper, if you allow me to bring you a bit, push you a bit further on what you were putting forward. Of course, when you look at the recipes that you've put forward for the Mediterranean region, there's a lot of parallels to be made with the recipes that are also present in the European scene, with the recovery plan based on the need for greener economies, green transition, the importance of digitalization, and for economies and so on. And also you put that as challenges for the Mediterranean region. So you would assume that there is some parallel to be made here between the way Europe wants to recover and the way the Mediterranean needs to recover and follow similar transitions in that sense. However, the different tools and the funds that have been put forward for Europe internally do not have much to say about the evolution of the Mediterranean region, and are conceived basically as something to revolutionize, let's put it this way, the European economies. What would you, and here's the question, what would you put forward as the main ideas linking the fate of both regions with regards to these two transitions, the digital and green transition? Is there any way that, thanks, for instance, to the internal recovery fund and the reconstruction of the European economies and societies after the pandemic, also has a positive effect on the Mediterranean? Are these two separate paths that we are starting to pursue, and thus the danger being that there will be further divergence once the recovery has consolidated, further divergence between Europe and the Mediterranean area? So in other words, how would you bring together the efforts that the Union is doing internally to recover from the coronavirus crisis and the needs that the Mediterranean has put forward, as you very rightly mentioned in your presentation? This is something that I would like you to go a bit deeper. If you would like to start with this while we wait for further questions, I'm already having one that I will. Since it deals with the same issue, let me ask it now so that you can take both or make a mix as you please. And it comes from Hector Sanchez, who's a researcher here at CIGAP, also focusing on Europe, European affairs and the Mediterranean. So he says, Mr. Ayadi, what is the foreseen impact of the new agenda for the Mediterranean and the NDC recently approved by the European institutions? So again, linking the external or the neighborhood instruments that the European Union is putting forward and its own agenda for the Mediterranean. And he says, and if I am allowed a couple more, is there any measure in place to prevent brain drain, reskilling of young people, and enhancing local economies and communities? So these are the questions that I would like to first ask you, and then if there are any more, we can have a second round of questions and answers. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Paul. These are very important questions, and I can tell you, based on the presentation I made, I didn't go into what I call the blue transition scenario. The blue transition scenario, it's really how to link the different regions, mainly the Mediterranean, Europe, and Africa. The future is a collaborative future, and we've seen it. We've seen it because, first of all, this was a global pandemic, and it required a global solidarity. Okay, so this is from a global point of view. Now, in terms of the region, Europe has always been a privileged partner for the Mediterranean over years of collaboration and partnership. And I would say that in the Arab uprising in 2010, 2011, probably Europe missed that opportunity. Nowadays, there is a new opportunity to, I would call, have a convergence approach to deal with the global transitions for the Mediterranean, which means that the digital transition, the healthcare transitions that we're living, and then the green transition, these three transitions will help put the regions together, and particularly the Mediterranean, and also Africa, because also the EU is enhancing its partnership with Africa as a continent. And I believe that obviously you mentioned it. I mean, the EU is putting all the resources for Europe to accelerate its transition, particularly the green and digital, and now also health, as I mentioned, because we've seen clearly that even at EU level, the level of preparedness to face such a pandemic has been huge. I mean, has been difficult. I mean, hasn't been what we would have expected, and this has led some consequences, socioeconomic consequences, particularly in some countries. I mean, Spain being one of them, and Italy and Greece, and particularly the countries that were already suffering more from the financial crisis. Now, in the Mediterranean, when I look at the spectrum from Morocco to Israel up to Turkey, and if we want to include Turkey, the evolution of those countries is not, I would call it, very diverse. The region already from within is very fragmented, and it has been suffering over the last decade from the political and socioeconomic transition coming from the Arab uprisings. And up to today, this is not something which has allowed those countries to move into what I call a resilient path. Actually, they are in a very fragile path. We've seen the case of Lebanon. We are seeing what is happening in Tunisia, for example. So I think we need to look at each country based on its own specificities. And I believe nowadays Europe, EU, within this new institutional setting of the G International Partnership, which is very, very important development, because nowadays it's becoming international partnership. It needs to look at these countries and try to engage as much as possible to convince those countries to participate to those transitions, which it shouldn't be a difficult convincing exercise, because these are all global transitions. So whichever country doesn't want to participate, they will find themselves completely disconnected from these new developments. And the countries that do not invest more in innovation, in low carbon economy, they will have problems, because then they will not find eventually buyers for their resources and products in the long run. But this is really in the long run. Okay, this brings also the question about other players like China, like India, like Russia, like others. And this, of course, might complicate the role of the EU eventually. But I think everything can be dealt with dialogue and some agreements and partnerships.
Thanks, Rim. Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Thanks very much for covering these issues. I think this provides the additional framework to what you were mentioning, and precisely something that we've been working on here at CEDOC is not so much studying these transitions, to which you added the blue transition and the blue economy transition as well to the mix separately, but rather trying to make the link between them and all the importance on the twin transition that adding to the blue economy transition would also make a third transition.
Paul, let me clarify, because maybe I was not clear on the blue transition. The blue transition, I'm not referring to the blue economy. Okay. Blue economy, it's the economy of the sea. Okay, this is a specific sector which is important as well, since we are dealing with the Mediterranean as a sea. But for me, the blue, it's because it's the blue of the Mediterranean, which is trying to put together different civilization and different groups, which is Europe, Mediterranean countries, that are North Africa, Middle East, within a certain framework of what I call it a differentiated framework, which allows a certain level of development based on those, a green transition, digital, and then really moving together into this type of what I call the blue transition. But it's blue, it's because of the sea. We can call it something else, but in reality, the blue transition, it's really focused practically on what I have explained, which is the TRIS development model. So more transparency between the actors, which will foster, trust and accountability. More responsibility between the actors, which will really make sure that this model can function. More inclusiveness and more sustainability. So practically speaking, I'm talking that these transitions, if they are put in the context of the Mediterranean Sea, they will allow the Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa to move into some converging ideas and converging concepts and models, which will help the whole, the different regions to develop and prosper.
Thank you, Rim. Let me give the floor to Ernest Maragall, Vice President of the Metropolitan Area of Barcelona, whom I would like to thank as well for the opportunity to gather us all here in this conversation. Ernest.
Sí, en anglès o en català? En català, millor.
Com vulguis.
A veure, jo escoltant, senyora Ayadi.
Whilst listening to Mrs. Ayadi, it's highly stimulating, all of the things you have said. But let me share some thought with you, especially from the point of view of the northern shore, i.e. the EU, with regards to the Mediterranean basin. I like very much the concept. I think it's a very interesting concept. When you talk about the blue transition, when you refer to the whole Mediterranean space, but I wonder, what are the minimum requirements in the global concept or the globalization of the economy do we need in order to carry out this process? Should we give a greater value to the concept of proximity? You have said beforehand during your presentation, at some point, talking about health facilities. Should we produce them or should we import them? Can't we have a greater production capacity of our economies in the Mediterranean? But then next, I would wonder myself, is that possible without changes in institutional quality and greater democratic depth in these countries' institutions? Would that be possible without changes in the social structure that still include male chauvinism, gender inequalities, paternalistic attitude on the governmental side, etc.?
In my view, that's my humble opinion, it's very difficult to converge or even to integrate and have a concept of integration that is really credible if there is no minimum recognition of the institutional aspects and governance aspects. It's very important. And I think institutional proximity or institutional convergence, what I call rule of law, and corruption, the view about corruption and all of this, elements are essential to have a certain, close levels to be able to move socioeconomic integration. This is very important in all sectors, be it in trade, be it in infrastructure, be it in finance, be it in human interaction. This is very important.
Do you see a role for European institutions in this field?
I think there is a huge role because European institutions and European Union in general, they have the history of convergence and the maximum harmonization and,
But we are not doing so. We are not playing these roles.
Not at all, because of course, this is something which is also linked to the, these are countries which are not going to be, it goes back in fact to the whole debate about whether those countries will access certain privileged type of partnership with the European Union or not. But then if they are there separate, it's very difficult. I remember we had this reflection many years ago before the Arab Spring before the Arab uprisings in 2010, and we thought, I mean, that was a scenario. It was a kind of a normative scenario which we tried to test and so on. It's called the Euro-Mediterranean Union. That was the thinking back then. But this is a complete utopia. It's a complete dream which will probably never happen. And this is why we moved into what we call the blue transition, the blue scenario. The blue scenario, in fact, it's all the regions are separate. But then they agree on certain objectives and they try to collaborate either on sectors or objectives or anything, and then they work together. But you touched a very key point, which is the institutional point. I think there should be more dialogue, this is what I can say, within a certain systematic framework. I think the Union for Mediterranean should play a very important role, or at least its role should be more enhanced into that respect, so go beyond probably what they're doing currently. And yes, I think, and the European Union probably should take a more active role in this aspect.
Just a final, more specific question. Mm-hmm. Should we, how to say, should we go ahead in terms of substituting tourism as a main source of economic regions? I think we should abandon the tourist model, the tourist dependence model we have, for instance, in our city, but not only. I think that's the case for most or for many of the Mediterranean economies and the city subsistence. Then I think it's coherent with your thinking and your views and effort, and a specific effort to change this productive model based on highly dependent on tourism. Do you agree?
It's a very good question. I mean, I've been thinking about this since many years already. I mean, I might not have the full answer yet. But one thing I can share with you is, number one, a sector that is too much reliant on huge consumption of water, a sector that is, of course, using concepts which is, in my view, the service sector has been highly, or call it the service and leisure, has been hardly hit by the COVID-19. The countries that have huge reliance on the touristic industry have been largely hit by COVID.
Exactly.
So for me, the way tourism sector, which we call it the mass type of touristic concepts that have been developed many years ago, I mean, probably 30 to 40 to 50 years ago, so right after the Second World War, most probably, that's when, this has been developed. I think they're not working anymore. And we have, I mean, these major big infrastructures trying to have massive tourism coming to countries. And I think this has to change because, as I mentioned before, we need to move into more sustainable models for development based on the development of communities, the development of skills, reskilling. And I go back to the question that somebody answered and I didn't answer. I think education and training and reskilling and enhancing, these aspects very, very key going forward. Now, are we going to be able to change the whole touristic sector in the economy very fast? I'm not sure, because there are some countries that are really basic. And this is why when you integrate some of the cultural dimensions, so cultural tourism, linking it to sustainability factors, this might adapt. I would say the touristic sector might need to be adapted to certain to the new trends, or the current trends, the modern trends. But of course, I agree with you. In the long run, this needs to be very carefully thought. I mean, for the Mediterranean region, for all the countries, in fact. But then if you integrate the creativity and the cultural dimension into the touristic sector, this might bring a different adapted model, business model for the whole sector to think. And also, as I mentioned, the communal aspect, trying to link to communities but then of course that you need stability and you need security. So these are all aspects that need to be thought of.
Thank you, Rim. Ernest, hi ha algun element més de clarificació?
Are there any other questions or any elements that need to be clarified? We can't hear you, Ernest. Your mic is off.
Just that I would be glad to follow this conversation, Mrs. Ayala, in a more particular frame. No? I will try, if you permit me, if you let me try in the next weeks. Taking account that you are not so far, and you are here in São Paulo, no? At least for a week. Yes. Thank you for being here, in any case.
Okay, Rim, thank you very much for your time, for providing such a comprehensive framework, for answering also to the questions that were raised during the conversation. It's been stimulating. Lots of challenges ahead, but in any case, at least we have them on our plates. Now it's time to take them on board. But in any case, it's been informative. Thank you very much, Rim. També moltíssimes gràcies a l'àrea metropolitana.
Thank you very much indeed to the metropolitan area of Barcelona for your support. And in general, its Deputy Chairman, Mr. Maragall, thank you for your commitment with CIDOB. This is one of the activities we carry out for the year within the framework of our cooperation agreement. And this hopefully will continue in the future. Thank you, AMB. Thank you, Rim, and thank you to all of you who have followed us, both in English and in Catalonian. Thank you very much indeed, and have a great day. Thank you. Goodbye now.